I'm Christy Carson, and today I'm talking to David Ruiter, who's at the University of Texas at El Paso. And David and I have known each other for a long, long time, mostly through conferences and joint visits back and forth between our institutions. David was kind enough to come over and review the Henry IV from Mexico and Henry IV Part 1, which was from Mexico, and Henry IV Part 2, which was from Argentina as part of the Globe Festival. And more recently, we've been working together on a book that he is actually editing on Shakespeare and social justice. So we have those interests in common. But I'm going to let David explain his current position and how he came to and what his role is in terms of online learning. So if you don't mind, David, that'd be great.
Sure. Thank you, Christy. I'm glad to be here with you today. So my role, so first of all, let's start from the beginning. I did learn many years ago how to deliver a course online. And I do feel, and I did that because, digital learning is part of the necessary learning, I think, for every student these days. As we prepare them for their next steps, this is going to be an expectation for every educated person, as far as I'm concerned. And so it's a readiness issue for, we can think about it as professional preparation, I suppose, but to do it within our disciplines and to understand best how to teach and learn within disciplines and within semi-contained spaces and conversations is really relevant for all of them in terms of their ultimate success as they move forward. So I learned it maybe already about a decade ago, and mostly have used it in hybridized formats in my own courses over time, including when I did study abroad courses and things like that. The hybridization was extremely valuable for the students because it meant that we didn't have to spend so much time in classrooms while we were visiting overseas, and particularly in London, Paris, Madrid, other places, where the students, of course, want to take full advantage of their learning experience in those locations, in the theaters, in the cities, and in the museums, on tours, and getting to know themselves in those contexts and feeling their agency in those contexts, which was tremendous. But of course, we also had the learning objectives for the course. And so, it was a way where we were able to do some face-to-face meeting when we were back on our home campus, and again, when we returned from the trip. But while we were gone, we were able to use a highly hybridized format so that the students could continue their learning, but they could do it at their pace. We didn't have to do it synchronously. So the asynchronous format in terms of discussion boards, in terms of theater reviews, in terms of research projects related to context, they were able to do those according to their own agenda, instead of me having to stipulate so firmly. So there, I was already feeling there the value of a combination of synchronous and asynchronous learning, of face-to-face and hybridized learning, of yes, the course learning outcomes, but now making sure that those learning outcomes included digital learning outcomes. And so we were beginning to move in that direction already. Then the pandemic.
Yes.
Right.
So that's my next question. What changed, and how? Because I'm interested in the whole online learning, and obviously one of the things I want to point out is the fact that it has a long history. But nothing prepared any of us for the fact that this wholesale change happened all at once. And how did that work in your institution?
Well, it's a good question, Christy, and I think I need to start by talking just a little bit about our particular context, because it is very relevant.
Absolutely.
We draw 85% of our students from the Paso del Norte region, which is this area right on the U.S.-Mexico border. And El Paso is right on that border, but we draw from both sides of the border for our university. And we also have 85% of our students are Latinx. We have over 70% of our students are Pell eligible, which means eligible for federal support for their education because they fall below certain socioeconomic markers.
Right.
Here's an important one, and I don't have the conversion to pounds at hand right now, but 37% of our students come from an annual household income of under $20,000.
Wow.
So, and one thing I need you to know about that, 37% of our students come from the annual household income under 20,000. 37% of our graduates in the last year also came from annual household income under 20,000, which
It's impressive.
means that we are able to support them through their educational pathway. And I'm
Yeah.
very, very proud of that. 85% of our students Latinx, so we are sort of the ultimate Hispanic serving institution in some ways, because that is our context, that is our population, and we are very proud to be able to work in this context and to promote the learning, the agency, the leadership of every student who comes through. But within the context of the pandemic, this brings up certain very, very particular challenges, which have, and that's why I gave you some of that information on the socioeconomic situation, because it has to do with the technology in the home that's available for our students.
Yeah.
So the first thing that we had to do when the pandemic hit was to make sure we had to invest a great deal into providing hotspots, little internet hotspots for students to be able to take to their homes. They could pick them up at the university and take them home. We have continued to need to leave some spaces at the university, computer labs open with massive social distancing guidelines so that students could continue their educations. That being said, I am really amazed, profoundly amazed by our students' agility in responding to the situation, learning how to learn online so rapidly. Now, you and I know they're better at this than we are in terms of the technology. You know, you put something new in front of me and it takes a little while, and probably, you know, I have to get on YouTube and do a tutorial or something, but with them, they can figure it out quite readily. So the challenge in terms of the pedagogy, I would say, was more on the faculty side.
Definitely, yes.
And I was asked as associate provost here to lead our effort in terms of moving, doing the online transition, moving from highly face-to-face to a fully online delivery model, right?
Okay.
We worked with a lot of people. The deans were tremendous. The chairs were tremendous. My colleague Beth Brunk Chavez, who runs Extended University and does the online part of the university, came in and helped us tremendously with her expertise and her whole team. We also needed to have IT with us, make sure we were taking care of these technology needs. The Center for Faculty Leadership and Development did a great job. Individual faculty members who had expertise did a great job of educating their peers. And
well, that was my question. Did you have a structured training? Because I think a lot of people, particularly in the UK, have slightly been thrown in the deep end with this, and the training and the support has been a bit patchy, I would suggest.
So what we did is we put a little bit of a call out. We knew a lot of the professors who were excellent at online delivery and at hybridized delivery. And we put a little bit of call out, and we had nothing to offer other than, you know, our need. And said to them, you know, would you be willing to help your colleagues, you know, learn how to do this?
Yeah.
And so we provided, Christy, a lot of structured tutorials, many of which we had to make up almost immediately, but we had the faculty who knew how to do that. We did that, but we also had these kind of open forum times where you could just come in almost as an online office hour and say, this is what I'm trying to do, and have a faculty peer available in real time online to help you figure out how to do that.
That's a very good idea.
Several weeks, and of course they could also put in help requests and say, you know, I don't need to do this immediately, but I'd like to learn how to do this. Could I schedule a time to work on this with somebody? And all of our instructional designers helped with that. But we just had to make sure that they knew how to reach out, and that when they did, that there was somebody there on the other end to help them.
Yeah. And how many of your courses were already at least using digital resources? I mean, this is one of my questions is that
Mm.
I use digital resources quite a bit in class, and we already had, the Moodle set up. And so there were, there was kind of a structure that you could move online. But if people are accustomed to more traditional, I suppose, teaching methods, the wholesale shift to an online environment can be quite jarring and time consuming. So yeah, the question I guess is how many of your faculty were actually able to make that shift more easily because they were halfway there, as it were.
Yeah, so I would say over 50% of our faculty, all of our faculty have a Blackboard shell,
Okay.
which is, I don't know if I need to explain what a Blackboard shell
No, I
is.
mean, well, we use Moodle. It's a virtual learning environment. So
Yes. So they all have a shell for their courses already. Now
okay,
we can see that we were able to see that over 50% of the faculty members use that shell, that online shell for some purpose. It could be as basic as posting syllabus and using it as a grade book.
okay,
But we knew that, but in other words, they went on there at some point, all the way
yeah,
to people who used it in its most robust capacities, right? And
right,
now, that doesn't take into account, though, the fact what you just mentioned is that, people using Zoom, people using Moodle, people using other platforms, that were maybe are very particular to, say, computer science or mechanical engineering, things that
right.
platforms that they want them learning and getting used to. So I would guess 70-80% of our faculty were doing something in a digital learning environment. I
Okay.
maybe not very much. It could be very, very minimal. But in other words, they knew it was there, which actually is a big hurdle, as you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think
So
that that's the other thing that I'm kind of interested in is the extent to which a lot of the particular literature colleagues, I'm looking largely at Shakespeare,
yeah.
are trying to minimize the effects of technology. But actually, you're saying that from a sort of administrative point of view, you're actually seeing the acquisition of these skills as being something that could be seen as part of the learning outcome.
Oh, 100%. I 100% believe that. I mean, I actually believe it's our responsibility as higher education entities to be preparing our students in this way. I mean, we need for them to be prepared for the world that is and the one that's coming, not the one that was. Right?
Yeah,
And
and I think
then,
that in a way, though, this has actually exposed the way that will be in a way that we hadn't seen before. Because I think the amount of the number of people who are now working from home, that's another big shift that again took this pandemic in a way for it to really take hold. But I think a lot of people aren't going to go back to the old ways. So I guess that's my next question: is how much do you think you'll take from the pandemic? The things you had to do into what you want to do for the future.
well, it's very interesting. I've had more conversations with more faculty members and more faculty leaders recently. And we're no longer having the conversation about getting back to normal, right?
Mm, yeah,
Um, People are beginning to realize that there are some advantages. Even some people I report to were a little bit concerned that we were going to see a major productivity loss in terms of people's work effort. Hasn't turned out that way at all. And in fact, we're probably seeing a bit of an uptick
yeah,
as to this. Now, do we all want to work from home forever? I don't. I think a lot
no,
of my colleagues like the community that we're part of, enjoy being around their students and colleagues and having that interaction that I think is necessary. I mean, it's also a social environment and a social growth environment. So I think we have to keep that in mind. And sometimes that element can be harder, as you know, in a virtual setting. We are still
yeah,
learning how to do that better. But I do think, Christy, that we've already seen a shift in our students from they were desperate to return to campus this fall. Now,
mm,
for a variety of reasons, but among, health and safety being primary, no doubt. But among the reasons that they're giving us are that they're actually enjoying some of the learning that they're doing. now some of their professors are much better at it than others. They're letting us know that,
I'm
we've
sure
got
that's
some work
true.
to do. But I actually think I've also heard from some professors who told me, that they didn't realize that they could do this well online.
Yeah.
And now they were thinking about how to hybridize a few things. Like, for instance, if you're going to show a play in a classroom, well, you don't really have to do that, right? And so, and we lose a lot of the social benefit of it anyway. We can come back and discuss it now in the classroom, right? And they're realizing how they just can put that onto their Blackboard site, and now that can be content for discussion in the classroom.
Yeah.
And this goes back to that old terminology of flipped classroom to a certain
Yeah.
extent, right? About what you do in the classroom and what you do out. But I think it's a good moment for us to think about learning outcomes in that way, not just digital and face-to-face learning outcomes, but also outcomes that are like, what outcomes can best be facilitated in a digital context, which outcomes can be best facilitated in the face-to-face context, and then sort of optimizing the learning experience for the students with that knowledge in mind.
Well, and I think the other thing that, in talking to other people, one of the things that seems to be an advantage is not thinking about students necessarily as distance learners or in-house learners, as it were, but everybody being flexible. Because again, if you think about if we have another wave, or if somebody is in a family or an environment where they are suddenly in lockdown again, if they can switch to the digital mode, but not leave the classroom. Again, I think, students who are working, if suddenly they've got a work deadline and, they can manage to come to a class, but not necessarily physically get to the building. So, I mean, it may be that there are advantages for all kinds of reasons to have that flexibility. Are you thinking about a kind of, whatever you want to call it, blended learning, hybrid learning, bimodal approach for the future?
For myself,
For
for
the institution, I guess, or even for yourself, yeah.
well, I already do it, but I believe I've learned some things too, and
Yeah.
I'll do more. I'll do more in the future. I definitely think, yes, that colleagues across campus are going to be making use of this, regardless of any ability to return to fully face-to-face settings. I believe they're going to be making much more use of this in the future. And again, even if that means that they do hold their face-to-face hours, and they are there face-to-face with the students, they're learning what the students can be doing in the hours outside of the classroom that can facilitate a better use of time inside of that face-to-face classroom. So I think that's super important moment. And I love it, Christy, before we got on today, we were talking, you mentioned pedagogy a little bit, but let's be honest here. We've all needed to think more deeply about pedagogy. Particularly as institutions, we've needed to think more deeply about pedagogy and teaching and learning and how it's happening in the current context and in the coming context, more than we had until this moment came to us. And again, obviously nobody wants a pandemic. I mean,
No.
nobody wants that. But we are learning some things about ourselves and our own abilities to be flexible and agile that I think can contribute, as you're saying, to the students who have agility in these platforms already established to a certain extent, but that agility is being lifted up as a real asset in their lifelong learning now. And I think that's a real thing. Yeah.
And I think also one of the things, I guess, I was thinking, and in the conversations I've had so far, the reason I want to talk to people that I know is to show that, we have a community that do talk, and we usually talk at conferences and various other places, but quite often it is about research. It's not about pedagogy, but we all are deeply invested in this, and we are learning more about our own skills, as you say. So I think there's something really weirdly liberating about being allowed to talk about how, the things that we do well and what we bring to the classroom. And even this conversation, I think, works better because we know each other.
I agree, but I want to emphasize a point that you just made, Christy, because I think you just pointed up a real opportunity now. Yes, we're having more conversation around pedagogy and how we teach and learn, right? And in what context and what works better and things like that. I hope, and I'm sure that what we're doing right here is probably meant to leverage that a little bit, but I hope that conversation finds its way into what we have historically thought of as the serious conversations of our disciplines, right?
Yeah.
How do we work on teaching and learning around materials and ideas and their relevance to context that have always been valuable to us, but how do we do it better? How do we deliver better? How do we create better learning environments? How do we honor context more than before? I mean, all those things are possible, I think.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that I would suggest is that, at least in Britain, I don't know if what it's like there, but there's been an increasing divide between the faculty and the administration, because we seem to be going not necessarily in different ways, but at different speeds. And now there's been a kind of, an admission that we're all going in a new direction. We all have to work together, which again, I think is a positive outcome. But I guess I'm interested in what you think might be the drawbacks of this rapid change. Do you think there are any drawbacks?
Well, when we evolve quickly, we often make some mistakes. I think we are going to make those mistakes. I'm sure we are making those mistakes right now. But, a big part of learning, whether it's social learning or academic learning or professional learning, has to do with making those mistakes and understanding what can be learned by making an effort, making a positive effort, and realizing it didn't work. It didn't work as well as we had hoped. But trial and error is something that also is an opening. It can create an opening, a little bit more courage. That I took a risk. Not all of it worked great, but some of it did. So I'll keep what worked, and I'll learn more about how to make the stuff that didn't work better. And I do also think. Let me tell you a quick little story. A few years ago, I went to Canutillo High School, and I spent a lot of time over the course of a year with the English and language arts teachers in that high school. Canutillo is one of the, in terms of their student population, one of the most under-resourced schools in our area, and we have a lot of poverty in our area overall. So to be one of the most under-resourced is saying something. One thing I found out very quickly is that the teachers in those classrooms were using a lot of technology with their students.
Okay.
And so we had an idea that our students were coming to us with very, very limited ability to function in a digital learning environment, when in fact they had been trained for just such an environment. And they got to us a little disappointed that they couldn't make use of these skills. Right?
Okay.
So we had to play a little, I realized then that we were, as you suggested just a moment ago, we were a little bit tardy on the evolutionary growth pattern there, and we had some work to do. Now, that's been made super manifest right now, I think. But again, I think mistakes are going to be made as long as we can be reflective and operate with some humility and courage simultaneously. I think we can ultimately use it for a great positive.
That's the other thing, I think there's been both a lot of misunderstanding about what's been happening at the schools level. We've been working very hard at Royal Holloway. We were the transition from university to from a high school essentially, or the A level into university seemed to be more of a shock for them, and yet they had more skills in other areas that we weren't tapping into. So again, the assumption that a lot of, I think, lecturers often make is that whatever preparation they had for university is what students still get, when in fact it's changed dramatically. So I think, this is, as you say, forced us to be a bit more humble, but also kind of raise our heads from the desk and look around and see what's actually going on, as opposed to working from our assumptions.
Christy, I think you just, you know, again, you're like sparking so many thoughts with what you're saying. But the truth of the matter is we haven't done a very good evaluation of the assets our students are bringing to us.
Yeah.
Right? Whether those are cultural assets, whether those are identity assets, whether those are digital learning assets, whether those are work experience assets, you know, I think sometimes because it's sometimes difficult for us to admit that our students actually are much more expert on some of these topics than we are.
Mm-hmm.
And that we're the ones who have to learn and catch up to where they're at, you know? And I think that's happening in this context. But if we can take a more asset-based approach to our students in general, what you just suggested, understand their funds of knowledge a bit more fully, I think we can really elevate student success and teaching and learning at the institutions. But that takes you know, a commitment. That takes a commitment to understanding our students and understanding that our students don't function as a monolith, that there's a great deal of diversity there, and that diversity can function as an amazing strength, or it cannot.
Yeah.
If we don't acknowledge it, then we're the ones who are wasting the positive um,
The elements
impact.
that people are bringing to the party, essentially. And I think that's the other thing that's been really nice about this, is because you know, everyone is literally on the same page if you're on a Zoom call or something like that. There's a much more of a sense of collaboration in some cases, because if you don't know what you're doing, you know, a student can chip in and
Yes.
say, well, actually the button's over there, and, you know, or they can help their peer. So it's a leveling thing, but it also feels to me like there's more investment on the part of the students, because they feel that it's partly their responsibility to make it work.
Yeah.
And I think, you know, I think that just, you know, we're of an age where the teacher at the front of the class used to be the authority. And I think what's happened is that, as you say, there's the flipped classroom, but for a long time there was also, at least in my experience, a little bit of trepidation on the part of the teacher about being recorded, you know, either by the students individually or by the institution. So it made you feel a little bit on the back foot. But when everyone's recorded at the same time, it again, you're creating, I'm afraid I always think in theater terms, you're creating a joint, you know, communal experience. And there are going to be people who are going to be better at the text, and people who are going to be better at the visual stuff, and people who are going to be good at the technical stuff. But together, you can make something really interesting.
I agree. I agree 100% with what you just said, Christy. I don't even have much to add to that. I think that's the actually, again, right? I mean, although maybe I'll put a few terms that are relevant in our disciplines as well.
Okay, sure, yeah.
On what you just said. I mean, what you just described there is a decolonizing, anti-colonizing effort in the teaching and learning communities that we provide at the universities. And we are responsible to do that work. We are.
Yeah.
And the fact that it can happen in some of the ways that you just articulated, I think it is wonderful. So let's make use.
Yeah, absolutely. So this series of conversations is not aimed at students, because we've already figured out that they know what they're doing. It's aimed at teachers. And so if you were just starting out, if you're going to work with a faculty member or somebody who had never done online teaching before, come up with a tip or two. What would you tell them to reassure them, or to just get them started in the right direction?
Well, most of them know how to use their phone.
There you go.
And use their computer. So one thing, again, if we take an asset-based approach, they're not starting from scratch in terms of a digital learning environment. They're not. There are things that they know. And I would try to let them know that those things that they know from the apps that they use, or what they do, even in terms of word processing or the grade book or whatever else that the university is teaching them do, it's just an extension of those skills. It's just, they have some fundamentals in place. I would encourage them to understand that they have some fundamentals in place, that the university also often has some fundamentals in place for them, like a digital learning platform of some sort, you know. And you know, we all like to be very self-reliant, you know, but I think, you know, encouraging them to understand that they're part of a community of learners themselves, and reminding them that that's why they got into this whole thing in the first place, was because they like to be part of a community of learners. And this is just a new thing that where they can learn with their, I actually think in my experience that colleagues and peers have been tremendous and generous and thoughtful in working with their colleagues and peers, because the people who, it's one of these things, right? It's a little bit of a freakonomics argument in some respects, right? But if you think about, you know, where Stephen Levitt says that, you know, there's a correlation between the number of books in the house and the children's literacy level,
Right,
right?
right. Yeah.
There's a correlation between parents who buy parenting books and good parenting. But it doesn't mean that they're even reading the books. They're just taking it seriously.
Yeah.
They're taking it seriously. So when you take seriously the education of the students and realize that you're part of a learning community that's full of resources, including your colleague, you know, down the hall, well, virtually down the hall for all of us now.
Yeah, yeah.
But to reach out a little bit and to, with some humility and some courage, and to say, hey, you know what, I want to be good at this. I know I can be a good educator in other contexts, but how do I take all that I'm able to offer in one context and move it to this new context? And in other words, I guess what I'm saying, Christy, is there are things that they know, there are communities that they're part of, and this doesn't have to be so very fearful, you know, moving forward. People have done it, you know, and people are doing it, and people are willing to help others to do it. And I love, though, I'm going to think more about what you said today, because you're right. When I have been teaching online, the students often will jump right in, and they'll tell me how to do that better in the digital learning venue, right?
Yeah.
They'll be like, oh,
Yeah.
it works better if you do it like this way rather than that way. It takes very little just to be open to those suggestions and to learn on the spot, and and to grow quite a lot when you let the students have a little input and just say flat out, I'm not sure this is going well. Does anyone have any suggestions? And they will.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, we've always had no fear Shakespeare for a long time. So now we need, you know, no fear online teaching.
Yeah, exactly.
In terms of your own teaching, what will you take forward from this period, do you think?
You know, as you know, Christy, I've always been, you know, I truly believe that our students come to us rich in assets and rich in ability, right? Yeah. And I think, to me, though, it's a little bit on that last point, recognizing that there are things that I bring to the learning community and things that they do. And so it's given me a little bit more sense, even than ever before, that we share in the pedagogy, and we share in the good ability to reach the desired outcomes in these situations. It is not mine to give to them. It's ours to discover together, and that the outcomes that we reach as a community.
Thank you. That seems like a perfect place to stop. And thanks so much for your time today, David.
Great conversation. I always enjoy talking with you, Christy.
Oh.